Is the Steam Deck OLED worse at lower TDPs? Yes. Well, no. Actually, it's a little bit complicated, and basically what you need to know is, no, the Steam Deck OLED, for all intents and purposes, is actually more efficient than the original Steam Deck LCD. Aerith is less efficient than Sephiroth, the newer version out there. Typically, what we're looking at is that you're going to be anywhere from 8 to 12% more efficient, generally speaking, that the new OLED model will be a little bit better. Just a tiny bit, nothing crazy, and we're going to go over how that actually looks, but hopefully by the end of this video, after we take a look at benchmarks in all the different TDP slices, 15 watt, 10 watt, and 5 watt, you're going to look at that and you're going to be a little bit curious how that is occurring. After you take a look at those benchmarks, I'm going to define for you how TDP actually works on these platforms. And it should open your mind to actually how TDP works, because a lot of people really have a poor understanding of how TDP works. So I had made a video well over a year ago where I titled it, "The TDP on the Steam Deck is Wrong." Largely everything that I said then is true today. Now, that title is clickbaity, and there was nuance in the video where it's not technically wrong, because if we average out the distribution of wattage that's used by the platform, if we set a 15 watt TDP cap, we're using about 15.3 watts or so. And if we take a look at other platforms like AMD Renoir, if we set a 15 watt TDP cap, just like average FPS is not a very useful metric for determining performance on games, average TDP and a CPU plus GPU workload isn't all that worthwhile, because how it actually works is for slices of time, if the APU is using 10 watts for a slice of moment at a 15 watt cap, that means that it can average itself out. It has to average itself out to 15 watts. So if it goes down to 10 watt for a slice of time, that means that it can boost up to 20 watt for a slice of time, because 20 watt and 10 watt is averaged out to 15 watts. That's how CPU and GPU workloads work. Now, there is a caveat there. There are differences. On AMD Renoir, that's handled differently. On Phoenix, it's handled differently. On Rembrandt, it's handled differently. Technically speaking, AMD Rembrandt and Van Gogh share the same ratio, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. Right now, what I hope to show you when we're taking a look at the benchmarks first in this video is you'll have a conception of what the performance difference is when we set a TDP cap. However, by the end of this video, you should understand that forcing a TDP cap is not the correct lens to be looking at the Steam Deck OLED because of how it's configured. So with that knowledge, let's just jump straight into how the benchmarks work, and then we're going to do the education process to show you why the Steam Deck OLED is actually, technically speaking, around 8 to 12% more efficient than the older Steam Deck LCD. Let's get into it. So again, even though we're going to be going over these benchmarks right now, and there are going to be large disparities when we take a look at these different TDP caps, please rest assured that later on in this video, I'm going to explain why you're actually seeing these results. So up first, we're taking a look at Batman Arkham Knight. This is an Unreal Engine 3 game, and it is a pretty heavy Unreal Engine 3 game, so I always like to include it in my test. Specifically, I like to take a look at different game engines and whatever game was hard in that particular engine. So first, we're going to take a look at Batman Arkham Knight. We're going to take a look at it through the 15 watt slice. Again, we're only going to be comparing the OG Steam Deck, so the Steam Deck LCD versus the Steam Deck OLED. When we take a look at our 15 watt slice, we're seeing that we have around almost a 13% performance improvement on averages between the OG LCD Steam Deck versus the OLED one. And we're looking at 10% increase on 1 percentile frame. So this is actually a very good result for an Unreal Engine 3 game, but we're seeing that we're getting effectively 10 to 13% better performance on the Steam Deck OLED versus the OG Steam Deck. Now, this is not going to be true across the board for all games, and we're going to understand a little bit more, again, why that's the case. Now, if we take a look and drop this down to a 10 watt cap, we can start to see the difference here. So we're looking at more like a 4% increase in performance on the Steam Deck OLED versus the Steam Deck LCD, and our 1 percentile, we're looking at around a 5% increase. So small, modest gains, but generally speaking, pretty much the same. And I think this is where Valve really wants to kind of have the Steam Deck OLED, especially, again, like I said earlier on in this video, in the beginning of the video, that we should look at the Steam Deck OLED through the lens that this is a Switch OLED, much like how the Switch to Switch OLED is. That's how we should be looking at this. Now we get to the part that is going to be confusing a lot of people. And again, I'm going to be explaining this as we go along. We're looking at the Steam Deck OLED on the bottom here. That means that the Steam Deck LCD inside a 5-watt TDP cap is 50% more performant. Now, again, that is not actually true. It is a 5-watt TDP cap on both systems. However, we need to understand a little bit more. So that's what we're showing when we do a 5-watt TDP cap. Again, we'll discuss more about what's actually going on under the hood in a little bit. Let's go over to the next game. Up next, we're going to be taking a look at Cyberpunk 2077. This is obviously the 2.0 build of the game. I run at 800p with the Steam Deck preset. However, I disable FSR. I'm not using any image reconstruction techniques here. So I am running at 800p native. When I do these tests, there's something interesting here that I want to kind of address, and we'll take a look at it in a moment. What we're taking a look at is at our 15-watt TDP slice, we can see that the OG Steam Deck, the LCD one, is showing around 7% better average FPS. However, when we take a look at the 1 percentile, we can see that the Steam Deck OLED is actually performing better. This is showing around 26% better. This is probably somewhere in the realm of correctness. Now, the only reason that I actually redid this test and got pretty much the same results, when we understand previously how the Steam Deck works, we know that there are diminishing returns on performance basically past 11 watt. 11 watt to 15 watt, you're not really going to get all that much gains. If we take a look at the LCD version, we're looking at around 9% gains. And generally speaking, that is correct. And when we take a look at the gains from the 1 percentile, they're pretty much right in line. So what we're looking at here is what it is. If we take a look at the 10 watt for the OLED versus the LCD, we can still see that the LCD is beating it by around 21%. But if we look at our 1 percentile, this is where the power differences on the OLED version is going to start kind of aligning with the LCD version. And we're taking a look at it's more or less in line. And once again, we take a look at OLED being substantially less performant than the LCD version. And this is because of how TDP operates on the OLED model. Again, we're going to talk about this in just a moment. Let's go to the next game. All right, so the next game I'm going to be benchmarking here is Deus Ex Mankind Divided. I am running DirectX 12 here. Now, this is a game that I typically like to run with DirectX 11. When I started the test on the Steam Deck, originally I did it in DirectX 12, so I just continue doing it. However, I like running it in DirectX 11 just because it's a DX11 hard game. This is like the last generation of DX11 games that came out just before image reconstruction or even just resolution scaling at all was present. This is also like Assassin's Creed Origins or Odyssey. I think it's Origins. Origins is just before resolution scale came out there, so that's another DirectX 11 hard game. But if we take a look at this game, I am running all ultra settings and at 800p and with DirectX 12. We take a look at this settings here. You can see that the Sephiroth, the OLED version, is around 7% better, and our 1 percentile is also around 7% better. When we go to 10 watt, we can see that it's basically even with the OG Steam Deck, and this is pretty much the case for 1 percentile as well. And then when we go to 5 percentile, we can see that Aerith, or the LCD version, is far more performant. We're getting around 61% better performance. But again, that doesn't paint the whole story here. I just want to kind of show this reoccurring theme that we're seeing here, that when we hard cap 5 watt on the OLED model, what we're seeing here is a giant disparity. But again, rest assured, I will explain what's going on later on in this video. Let's take a look at the next game. Okay, so next up, we're going to be taking a look at Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. Now, these settings that I'm using are kind of a mix. I am running 720p. I am using FSR2 balance, but there is a mixture of different settings I use. You can actually find my exact settings if you look at my Ratchet & Clank video that I did for Steam Deck, and I explain my exact settings part for part there, so you can get those exact settings if you're interested. And these are what we're looking at. So at our 15 watt slice, we're looking at the Steam Deck OLED and LCD essentially being absolutely equal. The thing changes here that the LCD version actually winds up being more performant at 10 watt. And again, we'll even address why this is happening, because what we're seeing is happening technically across all wattages. So this is, again, we're going to explain this in just a moment. So we can take a look at our averages, and they're basically the same. Our 1 percentile, the LCD version is around 6% faster, but our 0.2 percentile is around 36% faster. So this is where we're going to start seeing these weird power anomalies. And again, we'll explain that in just a moment. If we take a look at our 5 watt, the Aerith version, the LCD version is significantly ahead, around 60% more performant. So that's Ratchet & Clank. Let's go on to the next game, which is going to be Red Dead Redemption 2. Okay, so here is Red Dead Redemption 2. I am running 800p. This is using the Vulkan backend, but inside that Vulkan side, when you can go through all those settings, it's all the base preset models for there. at the top, I am using the lowest preset. And make sure if you're going to try to replicate my settings on the lowest preset, you actually have to dial it around a bit before you go back down. There may be some settings there that it will show that it's all the way low, but there's going to be some other settings that are actually ticked differently. So make sure you just fiddle with the preset at the top and then go all the way, push the slider all the way to the left, and those are the types of settings that I'm going to be using. At 15 watt, we can see that the LCD version is actually pulling ahead here. Not significantly, around 3% more on averages and around 5% more on 1 percentile. However, the Sephiroth one is ahead of 0.2 percentile by about 12%. Effectively, when you're playing these games, especially doing a frame cap, you're going to probably notice that the Steam Deck OLED version is going to be doing better in a number of situations. But if we just take a look at it through this lens, you're going to see some differences here, and you're going to be asking questions why this is so. So at 10 watt, we're looking at around a 4% performance improvement on averages and around 18% better on 1 percentile, and the same for 0.2 percentile. So again, we're going to explain why this is. And once again, if you take a look at 5 watt, you're going to see a big difference there. So let's go over to our last game, which is going to be The Last of Us Part 1. All right, so The Last of Us Part 1. Once again, I am using a mixture of settings. I have done a video on The Last of Us Part 1, and in that video, I listed the settings that I was using. That is the settings that I'm using here. So if you're curious, you can just look up that video to get those particular settings. So we're going to go through the list here. Now, if we take a look at our averages, the Sephiroth, the OLED version, is around 4% better. Our 1 percentile is also 5% better. So effectively a 5% performance improvement over the LCD version. When we go to 10 watt, Sephiroth, the OLED version, is still ahead. We're looking at about 2% difference. There, our 1 percentile takes a small hit. The Aerith LCD goes ahead 3%. Basically, these guys are pulling punches back and forth. Overall, 10 watt should be largely exceedingly similar between these two platforms. And then when we go to 5 watt, I also include a 400 megahertz scope in here. So one of the things, Aerith obviously is winning. So you can see Aerith right here is winning. And then down here we have Sephiroth Force 400 megahertz and the OLED 5 watt. OLED 5 watt, what I had noticed was that when I was running this game, that RAM was running at around 600 megahertz. For what it's worth, I think that's actually a correct stance to take. It should be running at 600 megahertz. The reason why forcing to 400 megahertz would actually produce slightly better results, so you can see I got like 2% better on averages, 1% better on 1 percentile, and 6% better on 0.2 percentile. You would think that going to slower RAM should make things worse. But when we're in a extremely TDP constrained environment, you have to remember that the APU has 3 different parts to it. There's a CPU, GPU, and then something we call Uncore. Inside of Uncore, one of the biggest power parts in there is the memory controller. The memory controller shares a clock domain with the RAM. So when we put the RAM at 400 megahertz, the memory controller runs at 400 megahertz. And if that Uncore runs at a lower frequency, that's taking less power, which means that we can get more power going to the CPU and GPU, thus getting a small performance improvement comparatively. So it's not a large performance improvement. 2% is barely nothing. So running at 600 megahertz generally, I think, is just a better off frequency to run at. I don't think that it's necessary to go down to 400 megahertz, but I'm just showing this to you that there are ways that we can optimize this a little bit more, especially in a heavily constrained TDP environment. However, for this game, this frame rate is completely not playable at all. So you wouldn't even be running at this in this scope. So that's just a little FYI about how APUs work. And this is something I've been talking about a lot, but if you're new to this channel, this gives you a little bit of a better understanding. But at this point, now that you've kind of seen all of the benchmarks, let's start talking about why this is happening. Okay, so now that we're done with the benchmark section of this, you should have a lot of questions, and I'm going to answer every one of them. And by the end of this video, you should have a clean understanding of not only how the Steam Deck OG and the Steam Deck OLED respond insofar as their TDP scopes and how all that power is distributed, but you should also have a better understanding of when we look at other platforms and how we need to collectively rethink how we're benchmarking performance on handhelds. We should stop looking at it from a TDP scope, and we should start looking at it from a total system power scope. And that is a hard task. That's one thing that I'm working through myself, and I'm trying to figure out how I can get there because it's a very holistic approach to trying to determine that. So I have to make sure that there is a foundational baseline that is shared amongst all of those platforms. Before I can get to that, let's just get into understanding how TDP works on the Steam Deck LCD versus the OLED. Then we're going to take a look at battery life between the two platforms, and then we're going to get a firm understanding of how more efficient the OLED version is. So up first, so right here you're looking at a histogram data of a 5-watt cap on the Steam Deck LCD. And you can clearly see that in a CPU benchmark, the wattage that is used pretty much predominantly is 5 watts exactly. So we're using 5 watts on the Steam Deck LCD inside of a CPU benchmark. This is how everyone thinks TDP works. We're going to slowly start showing you that's not how it works at all. So if we take a look at GPU benchmarks, you can see it's lightly colored there, but you can see at 5 watt TDP, a large percentage of it is at 6 watts. It actually goes up to 7 watts sometimes, and for brief moments, it actually uses up to 8 watts. On a 5 watt TDP cap, the CPU and GPU, if you're running a game, a 3D game, you never actually use 5 watts or under. You're only ever using over 5 watts in a 5 watt cap. This is what you're looking at when we take a look at those 5 watt benchmark numbers on the Steam Deck LCD versus the OLED. This histogram data should start to show you why the Steam Deck LCD is kind of cheating and why the Steam Deck TDP is wrong. Back to my original video that I did over a year ago. Let's take a look at the Steam Deck OLED. And here is OLED. Up first, we're going to take a look at the CPU benchmark on the left-hand side. You can see that in a 5 watt cap in a CPU benchmark, what you can see is 4 watts is what is used for the majority of the time in a 5 watt TDP cap. 5 watt gets used considerable, but not to the same degree that the LCD version is. In fact, we were mainlining 5 watt all the time and sometimes going into 6 watts. Very seldom going into 6 watts, but still, it would sometimes reach 6 watts. Whereas we don't even touch 6 watts at all. In fact, we have like a slim use of 3 watts, which is basically the slim watts of 4 watts on the LCD model. So already you should start to see a big difference between how power is distributed between these two models. They share the same ratio, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. Comparing that to like AMD's Renoir on 4800U, they're wildly different, and we're going to try to understand how this is all arranged. Moving over to the GPU benchmark wattage distribution for 5 watt on the OLED, we can see that sometimes we're actually going down to using 3 watts. The majority of the time we're using 4 watts, where on the LCD version, we were for the majority of the time using 6 watts. That's a 2 watt difference. And when we start looking at this, you're going to start seeing that the reason that the LCD version Steam Deck is getting more performance is effectively it's using more power, even though they both share the same TDP cap. And then we can see that 5 watt and 6 watt are the remainder of it. So this is histogram data of how the LCD and OLED work inside of a 5 watt TDP cap. This should already start to really explain how things work here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and show you some pie charts of how this actually works. We'll kind of just briefly step through that as well. Okay, so up next, we're going to be taking a look at the 15 watt TDP cap on the LCD version. If we take a look at the CPU benchmark wattage distribution, we can see that largely 15 watt is what's used. We do go up to 16 watt and 14, and we go down to 14 watt, but largely we're using around 15 watts in a CPU benchmark, meaning that our total system power is really going to be averaging around 22 watts because we're so firmly placed into 15 watt that all of the other power components, you're really just looking at around 7 watts used for total system power. However, when we take a look at Steam Deck LCD, when we do a game workload, so CPU and GPU plus Encore, this is when things get wildly out of control and shows you how big the range is on a 15 watt TDP cap on the LCD version of the Steam Deck. You can see that for the most part, you could think that for the majority of the time, we're actually using 15 watts and below. But the reality is that for 55% of the time on a 15 watt TDP cap on the LCD Steam Deck, we're at 15 watts and below. That means that 45% of the time, the Steam Deck LCD can go over 15 watts. So what we're taking a look at is 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. All of these are frequent wattages getting used on a 15 watt cap. Now remember, if a GPU workload is looking at time slices of data and it says, okay, CPU and GPU, we did that work and we're stalled, we don't have to do anything, we're going down to 3 watt. If you went all the way down to 3 watt, that means in a 15 watt TV cap, you can spike up like crazy to average out at 15 watts. And it's doing this exceedingly fast. And this is where things get really hairy, because if we take a look at the pie chart for the Steam Deck LCD and a CPU GPU workload at a 15-watt TDP cap, this is what that looks like. Now, this may seem a little confusing, okay? Because you're looking at a pie chart with a bunch of different slices, but what you're looking at here is a 15-watt TDP cap for the Steam Deck. This is running SteamOS 3.6 now, so the latest dev build. But I'm running this, and it's still the same as it was over a year when I did my Steam Deck TDP is wrong video. We can see here that if you take a look at the 15-watt mark, that generally speaking, if we slice off this pie, that 15 watts and below is 55% of all the wattages, meaning, again, 45% of the time, 16 watt and above is used on a 15 watt cap. Again, the 15 watt cap isn't a cap. It just means that it's trying to average around 15 watts. And when it's going crazy, going down below, it's going to spike up and boost pretty high. And this has been the main reason why it was unusual from us who were looking at older handhelds when we went to the Steam Deck that it was using more power than we normally would anticipate. So I'm going to show you really quickly what AMD Renoir, so this is the 4800U at 15 watt. Okay, so this is what the 4800U AMD Renoir looks like in a 15 watt TDP cap. Now, if I were to slice this off, if I was to put a demarcation line of what was 15 watt and below, you can clearly see that it's more shaped like a Pac-Man than anything else. Like it's mostly a whole pie, where only a little bit will boost over 15 watt, meaning we're only going to go up to 16 watt, 17 watt, and 22 watt very, very briefly. This is how I've often taken a look at older handhelds, because a lot of them were similar in this respect, in that they were generally an 80-20 split, meaning 80% of the time it was 15 watts and below if you were at a 15 watt cap. Basically, whatever TDP cap you set, we're taking a look at an 80-20 ratio, meaning if it's 20 watt cap, it can only boost over 20 watts 20% of the way, okay? And Steam Deck changed that up. It did 55-45, which is a much bigger scope and goes really wide. As you can see, we're sometimes actually going up to 29 watts for slices of time on the Steam Deck LCD back to the histogram data. So this is why we have used so much power there. However, things change on the Steam Deck OLED. Let's take a look at it. All right, so now we're taking a look at a histogram data of the distribution of wattage on a 15 watt TDP cap. If we take a look at our CPU benchmark distribution, we can see that we actually don't go into 16 watts nearly as much as we did on the Steam Deck LCD. And in fact, we actually go a little bit lower as well. So we're mostly using 15 watt, but we also go into 14 watt quite often. And this is really where you're going to see that Steam Deck OLED is typically a lot more efficient, because when we take a look at this, if we were to take a look at this in a pie chart, a 15 watt TDP, 97% of the power would be 15 watt and 14 watt. Very little is actually used. On Steam Deck LCD, 15 watt is and 14 watt are used around 87% of the time. So the Steam Deck OLED still is very, very good with regard to how much power it's using in a CPU-related scope. However, if we take a look at the GPU wattage power distribution, what we're going to see is that we don't go nearly as far in range as the Steam Deck LCD does. In fact, we pretty much have a hard shutoff at 20 watt when we're running in a 15 watt cap. So now you're thinking, okay, well, if AMD Renoir had an 80-20 split and Steam Deck LCD had a 55-45 split, what's the split on the Steam Deck OLED? And that's what I was curious about. And when I saw the results, it was really weird. So here is the pie chart of the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watt TDP cap. And what we can see here is that once again, we are taking a look at a 55-45 ratio. However, there's just a hard cap basically at 20 watt. So we're not going nearly as high as we were on the Steam Deck LCD, where it would just kind of use whatever it can. This has effectively a hard cap that it can't use past a certain wattage. And this tracks across all the different wattages. So at 5 watt, you don't have that big of a range that you can go up to. Yes, it can boost up over what it needs to. However, it's not going to do it all that much. It actually has a hard cap that it won't do anymore. So what we're looking at is another example that's a little bit odd and something that's new that I've never seen before, but it's another way that TDP can be arranged and constrained on these devices. Not only do we have a ratio, that can be different on different platforms. They change based on the workload. So CPU and GPU have different characteristics on TDP when you're checking them, but also the ratios inside of themselves, while they can be the same between two different platforms, there's actually a demarcation line that can be a secondary cap that can be put on inside of that same ratio, which is really interesting to see. But it's also why you're going to see that overall, we're going to get better power characteristics insofar as total system power. So hopefully, by taking a look at all of this data that you see here in front of you, that you have a better understanding of, again, TDP has a ratio per platform. So that can be different on all the different things. On AMD Renoir, it was 80-20. On Rembrandt and Van Gogh, it was 55-45. On Phoenix, what it looks like is closer to 35-65. So it's like a mix between Rembrandt and Renoir or Van Gogh. So it's a mix between those. And it's something where we're seeing a little bit better total system power versus what everything else is going on there. So overall, Rembrandt is very performant when looked at it through that lens. So with that information in mind, let's go to the last step of this video and take a look at worst case and best case battery life. I'm also pleased to report here that the OG Steam Deck LCD has significantly improved battery life since we originally tested it. I once again did my dead cells test as a best case scenario where I do medium brightness and I take off the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. And what we're seeing is we're actually getting very, very close to the 8-hour mark that Valve said that they would get to originally. So we're looking at around 7 hours and 45 minutes on the original Steam Deck, which is very, very close to 8 hours. This is fantastic. We're basically saving a whole watt here. This could be for a lot of reasons, maybe how the fan tuning is done with all the different updates. Disabling the fan was one of the big ways that I was able to save power and get over 8 hours. There's lots of different things that we can do here still to actually push this even further, but then you're going to have to start sacrificing frame rate. This is capped at 60 FPS, which I think a lot of people would like to have that capped at, so that's what I'm looking at here. On the Steam Deck OLED, this is once again sharing the same type of brightness setting. So the brightness panel on the Steam Deck has basically 100 lines. If you just count to 50, you're going to be at the 50% mark. When we take a look at that, effectively, as far as I can tell, the OLED panel and the LCD panel, the OLED panel, when it's pushing out SDR content, the same as what the LCD one would do, not HDR content, when we do 50-50 brightness, effectively, it's looking like the panels are using exactly the same wattage. The only difference that we're seeing is the power that is being used basically from the APU and the rest of the efficiency of the chip, which is where we're getting this effectively 10% number from. So not only do we see some games getting 8 to 12% better performance when we're doing 15 watt to 15 watt, the reason why we're getting that is because generally, efficiency-wise, even when we try to match the brightness of the panels up 50-50, which again, I have not done testing. Hopefully, like Gamers Nexus, who has the equipment to actually probe the OLED panel itself to see how much power it's taking, could get more decisive data. But from how I'm looking at this, when you match these and both have SDR content, they're effectively using the same amount of power. Now, with that said, while it's using the same amount of power, it does look like the OLED is a bit brighter. And in fact, when I take a picture of that and I kind of mess around with blackness and contrast, you should be able to see that the OLED is distinctively brighter, especially the font, the white fonts still stand out, and there is still some of the window light coming in the game. So that's still visible when the LCD is pretty much all gone. So even when they're both at 50-50 brightness on the scale, it still seems like the OLED is a smidge brighter, but I don't have any of the tools to test this. So again, this is just what I can see with my eyeballs and just messing around with the image on a captured picture. So that is it from the lens on a best case scenario. From a worst case scenario, we're once again getting 85 minutes on the Steam Deck LCD, again, because it can boost up and use so much power, but also the Steam Deck OLED is getting around 2 hours and 15 minutes. Generally speaking, that is what you're looking at on the OLED as a worst case scenario. So we're looking at around 2 hours and 15 minutes at a worst case, up to 11 hours on the OLED, which is huge. That's a real big improvement overall. And that's where I would say that this is kind of looked at from a generational standpoint, how much of an improvement that is. But also, once again, if we take a look at the total system power between these two platforms, we're looking at around 10 to 12% better efficiency in these places. So this is where that 10 to 12% number comes from, even when we try to lock these both in similar regard. So overall, the Steam Deck OLED is more efficient. However, if you try to cap at a low TDP, you're going to have very bad performance. And you should just have your mindset to know that it's using less power. So you literally just need to push a little bit more power. So you do like 7 watt or 8 watt on the Steam Deck OLED to match 5 watt on the Steam Deck LCD. And that is how you should be looking at it, generally speaking, so that you have a better idea. And yeah, it seems like a little clumsy, but unfortunately, TDP is not the best case, especially how fast and loose all these companies play with it and how they're vastly different on all these different platforms. But hopefully you have a better understanding at the end of this video now how vastly different TDP can be in different workloads, CPU only or CPU and GPU, as well as on different platforms having totally different characteristics. So that is it. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.